Good afternoon, this is Brown at IF Brown, and today we're going to be talking about Machine Man, the complete collection by Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko. So, Machine Man tells the story of a robot by the name of X-51, who was a member of a group of robots that was created by the military to not only have extremely advanced weaponry within their bodies, but also human-like intelligence, to go with them. But unfortunately, these robots ended up going rogue because they couldn't cope with both the human-like intelligence as well as the power to, wreak havoc. Kind of combined together, ended up being a bad combination. And so the military ended up destroying these robots, with the exception of X-51, who was spirited away by his creator, a scientist by the name of Abel Stack. And Abel took X-51 and into hiding and raised him as kind of like a surrogate son, even naming him Aaron. But what he was wanting to do was he was wanting to show that if one of his robots could be gradually raised with the process of being human, as well as having all this weaponry in its body, and as opposed to, say, instantly being put into a situation where they have to reconcile the two. He was wanting to prove that his robots could be, good functioning servants of humanity, as well as, remarkable members of society. And so X-51 ended up being given the moniker of Machine Man. And unfortunately, the military came into play, and Abel had to sacrifice his life to give Machine Man time to, escape. And so, when the story begins, Machine Man is basically on the run from the military that's trying to destroy him, not because of anything he himself has done, but for what he has the capability of doing. And so, while he's on the run, he finds himself in situations where he's having to decide, okay, do I follow the teachings of my father, and try and protect humanity, or do I give these people what they're expecting? Do I turn into a monster and tear this planet apart? And so that's the basic gist of the story. And he gradually, he grows as a character, and he's having to wrestle, with these conflicting emotions, and because he also realizes that, while he does have the capability of destroying humanity, he has to ask himself, does he have the right to do it? And when he's trying to decide whether or not to help humanity out, he's having to decide, is it even worth it when this very same humanity wants him destroyed? Excuse me. So that's the story of Machine Man in a nutshell. And this was this collection is something that I have mixed feelings about. There's a lot of good in it, but there's a lot of stuff that I was kind of let down by. But so it collects issues 1 through 19 of Machine Man's original series, which was the entire series that was put out. And it also collects issues 235 and 237 of The Incredible Hulk. And it also has a standalone story from issue 10 of Marvel Comics Presents. And so in reviewing this, what I'm going to try and do is break this down into segments here. And because when Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko both worked on this series, the quality varied, a whole lot between the two, as well as the storytelling from the people writing the stories in general. And so I guess we'll start with Jack Kirby's segment. And so for those of you who don't know, Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko are legendary comic book creators and artists who basically they gave us a whole lot of characters, both with Marvel Comics and DC Comics, that are very much beloved and by audiences. And Jack Kirby, he's the guy who co-created Captain America, Thor, The Incredible Hulk, Fantastic Four, Silver Surfer, a whole bunch of people. But with DC, he also gave us Etrigan, however you say his name. I think it's Etrigan, the Demon, as well as Mr. Miracle, the Forever People, Darkseid, the New Gods, and Steve Ditko is also, I'm not going to say like he's Jack Kirby's equal, but he is, I guess you could say, just as iconic, but in different ways. He gave us the characters of Spider-Man and Doctor Strange, who are arguably his best-known creations, or I should say co-creations. And then with DC Comics, he gave us the characters of The Question, as well as Shade the Changing Man and The Creeper. And so, having both of these artists work on one book, albeit not together, it's a rather unique opportunity to see, I guess, just two legends in one place. And that was kind of my incentive in checking this book out, as well as the fact that I'd always been intrigued by the character of Machine Man until I'd read this volume. I'd read a couple of stories here and there. There was a miniseries that was collected from a 1984 miniseries that took place after this, unofficially called Machine Man 2020, I believe. But I remember reading that one and thinking it was cool, but because I hadn't read any other stories with Machine Man that came before that, I didn't really have an understanding of certain references, that were thrown out. But so once I read this volume, that story made more sense. But anyway, though, okay, so Jack Kirby is called Jack the King Kirby for a reason. I mean, his illustrations have been inspirational to so many artists, and while his people had a distinct blocky look to them, his action scenes, the fight choreography, I mean, his depiction of, say, technology being created and used, I mean, like, we're talking like cutting edge stuff you see in the comic books. I mean, it was mind-blowing. Like, there were so many panels of his work, whether it be in this volume or just anything in general, where you just kind of stop for a few seconds and just stare in awe of just how much energy is put into it. But I honestly didn't know until I read this volume just how talented Jack Kirby was, not only as an artist but a writer as well, because usually he's best known arguably for working with Stan Lee on a lot of the Marvel Comics that he did. And so, seeing him actually take a shot at writing was a pleasant surprise, because, he's a little rough starting off within the first issue or so, but as his work continues throughout the issues he did, he actually improves as a writer. And not only do you have some good ideas that come into play, but you have some good execution as well. And Jack Kirby wrote and illustrated the first 9 issues of this series. And, that's where I think that the series was probably at its best, because, you see the character of Machine Man evolve. You see him, struggling with, the thoughts that I mentioned earlier, trying to decide whether, whether or not humanity is worth saving, at all, or if he has, just because he has the power to do it, should he do it? because they're constantly trying to destroy him, simply because of something that his now deceased brethren, you know, did. And I liked that because you not only see Machine Man's side of things, but you actually see the military side as well. And yes, the military is cast in an antagonistic light, as they are often in stories such as this, but there's actually some valid reason for them to go after Machine Man. Specifically, the character of Colonel Craig had a very, very good reason for wanting to have Machine Man destroyed, because he, while Machine Man himself isn't the one that went rogue, the group of robotic brethren that he had that did go rogue, they basically caused a lot of destruction and death. And not only did Craig lose a lot of men in this battle, but he also lost an eye. And so, yeah, it's more than a little personal. And so when he realizes that one of these robots is still on the loose and what it can do, yeah, it makes sense as to why he would want to destroy him. But I also appreciated, though, that, Jack Kirby had this character go from, an antagonist with an understandable motivation to someone who gradually comes around and realizes that, hey, this robot actually isn't a bad guy. He's someone that, he's basically been forced on the run by us. But nonetheless, when push comes to shove, he's always tried to help, people around him. And so he actually Craig goes through an interesting arc, where, he ends up becoming somewhat of an ally to Machine Man, but that's not until, say, the end of Jack Kirby's run. It's a work in progress. It's not something that happens overnight. And I liked that. I liked this gradual arc that he had. And there was also the character of Dr. Peter Spaulding, who Machine Man happens to meet and befriend, who is one of the few humans who actually treats Machine Man as a friend. And also because of his work in psychology, he's able to try and help Machine Man through his soul-searching process, if you will. And if it hadn't been for people like him, then Machine Man very may well have gone rogue. And so, and there's also little moments where, he has interactions with ordinary people, just kind of in a, subdued moment here and there. Like at one point, he's on the way to a battle, and it's in this battle, this villain that he's about to go up against. In a way, he himself is responsible for this villain being on the loose, and so he's rather guilt stricken. But he's got the whole "with great power comes great responsibility" thing going through his head, and so he's talking to the guy who's giving him a lift, and it's just an ordinary taxi driver. And I liked how they have this little conversation where, it's just for a few panels, mind you, but, because of this conversation they had with the taxi driver, he realizes that, yes, humanity as a whole is very screwed up and very hypocritical, but just because that's the truth, that doesn't, mean that the people who are good, the few people that are good in humanity, that doesn't mean that they deserve to be destroyed along with everyone else, which is what would happen if this villain that he's about to fight has his way. And so because of certain conversations like that, certain interactions he has with a few ordinary people who aren't trying to destroy him, he decides to become a hero, or at least he wants to do the right thing. And so I liked how there was just a lot of stuff going on there, along with the action. And speaking of the action, though, whenever Machine Man is, say, going up against the military, or, probably his most powerful foe in the Jack Kirby, issues, a robot being by the name of 10-4, the action scenes have an amazing flow to them. Like from panel to panel, like you see, how things get from point A to point B. And, it's like, say for instance, in one panel, you see, someone throwing a punch, and then in the next panel, you see, the other person getting hit, and then you see them on the ground in the next panel. I'm just giving you an example because, some artists, when they're trying to draw a fight scene, they, have it to where, say for instance, one character throws a punch, and then in the next panel, the character's instantly on the ground, and nothing in between. But Jack Kirby was really good at showing how things got from point A to point B to point C. Like it looked like you were watching an actual fight, regardless of how outlandish the characters looked. I mean, you believed you were watching an epic struggle between good and evil. And so, it was always exciting to look at, the fight scenes in this book. And it also helped that, I was getting invested in the story itself. And there's also some good moments of psychological horror that come into play, which I was very surprised by. Namely, like little moments where, like, he's having a nightmare about, these, I guess you could say, almost demonic-looking robots, trying to take his face off. And as you can see on the cover, he has like a human-like face, but with, clearly mechanical eyes. But the face is something that his father or his creator gave him to help him feel more comfortable with humanity, and he's come to cherish it. And so when he's having a nightmare about, about everyone trying to strip him of his humanity, which, taking off his face symbolizes in this nightmare. I mean, it's pretty terrifying because, he's being held against his will, and, you see these mechanical claws coming down, and you see these creatures taunting him. And, once they tear his face off, there's just like this mechanical, skeleton underneath. And, then their faces come off, and you see, basically just all this alien circuitry. And then, he wakes up in the woods, screaming in terror. And so, I mean, the way Jack Kirby drew that, though, I mean, I was so used to seeing him draw, epic, science fiction, stuff, or, just awesome battle scenes. But seeing him draw something at a nightmare that was so genuinely unsettling was a surprise for me, because very seldom have I seen him do something that was straight up horror, or at least a moment that was straight up horror. And I was impressed by that. And there was another moment where he's trying to so there's a robot named 10-4 that is from, I guess, another planet, or he's from a group of, alien robots that basically see all organic life as useless sacks of meat fit only to be destroyed or enslaved. And he's been brought to Earth partially by Machine Man himself. And anytime Machine Man tries to fight him, the military goes after both 10-4 and him. And so even though Machine Man's clearly risking his life for humanity, humanity still, distrusts him. And while it's understandable why they would do so, especially with what his brethren did, he finally has enough of it and just kind of storms off. And, 10-4 was taunting him during the battle that, his own race, once they get his transmission, they're going to come to Earth and take it over and wipe out humanity themselves. And so Machine Man, at this point, he's actually just, said screw it and, stormed away from the battle, because he's tired of, putting his neck on the line for, people who just want to cut it off. And so there's a moment where he finds himself wandering into this costume party, and a lot of the revelers are kind of drunk, and he's it's just sort of wandering around, making random small talk with them, and everyone's saying, whoa, your costume's awesome. Who are you? So they're like, hey, he's the man from Mars. He's a spaceman. And so they start, jokingly asking him, all these scientific questions about outer space. And they're saying, hey, is there life on Mars? Yada, yada, yada. And they're all laughing and joking. And Machine Man, he's laughing too. And finally he says, he has one of those moments where he says, screw it, I'll just tell him the truth. And so while he's going on laughing with them, he says, oh, hey, by the way, there's a race of robots that's on its way here, and they're going to wipe out humanity. Isn't that funny? And just little moments like that, and the way that everyone thinks that he's joking, and the fact that he's just so disillusioned with humanity that he sees it all as a joke, and he's going along with the joke, but he's telling the truth. It's a little moment that if you're invested in the story, it's a bit unsettling, that you see the main character, the hero as it were, just at this point of despair where he's willing to just tell humanity to its face, you guys are screwed. And so but naturally he comes around eventually and puts his life on the line again against 10-4. But the little moments like that, really stood out to me. And so, that was the Jack Kirby, portion. And that was probably, to me at least, was the best. Granted, I'm a little biased towards Jack Kirby already, but like I said, I didn't know he was as good of a writer as he was an illustrator. So his run, it was not only exciting, but it was also more than a little thought-provoking as well. And so now the second portion of this book, it consists of a couple of issues of Incredible Hulk, because I think what happened was the Machine Man series went on a hiatus for some reason. So for a time, issue 9 was not only the last issue that Jack Kirby worked on the series, but it was also the last issue in general for a time. And so Machine Man's story kind of segued into a couple of issues of the Incredible Hulk. And now at this point in time, the Hulk was more of the intellect of Bruce Banner was not keeping him in check. He was at this point, I guess you could say, a wandering monster, and his desires were very simple, and he was very bestial, and basically, he wanted to just be left alone. And he had a couple of friends, but everyone else, as far as humanity was concerned, as far as the Hulk was concerned, humanity, no good came from interacting with them. But due to a case of deliberate mistaken identity, courtesy of a mutual enemy of Hulk and Machine Man, the two of them end up getting into it, and it is oh man, it's a pretty crazy confrontation, because you have Machine Man, who's already been shown to be immensely powerful with all the technology that's been put into creating him and all the weaponry that he has. Machine Man himself is a force of nature to be reckoned with. But then you got the Incredible Hulk, which is literally unstoppable rage. The angrier he gets, the stronger he gets. And you actually see this happening in the issues that, that this takes place in. And also the fact that the guy who was writing these issues, a gentleman by the name of Roger Stern, was handling it, made it even better, because Roger Stern, to me at least, is easily one of the best old school comic book writers in the industry. He's been writing for several decades, and he's written classic stories from the 70s, 80s, even 90s. He's done work on Ghost Rider, Spider-Man, Superman, and in fact, I think as far as Superman goes, next to John Byrne's interpretation. I'd say Roger Stern's handling of the character was probably my favorite. But anyway, though, as far as the issues they wrote for the Hulk that are collected here, Roger Stern, he was a guy who could write several types of stories, and in this case, while yes, it's your traditional Marvel Comics story, with superheroes and battles and awesome conflict and all that, he also manages to make a pretty good horror story out of it, in the sense that the Hulk, when you get right down to it, is a monster that's out of control, or on the occasions he does have control, you have to tread very lightly with him. But in these issues, though, because of this case of mistaken identity that this mutual enemy has manipulated both Machine Man and Hulk on, the Hulk is just dead set on destroying Machine Man. And so you see just how horrifying the Hulk can be when he's been convinced that say certain parties have been have done harm to those he's cared about, and he's convinced that once again humanity in general is a threat. And for those of you who have seen, say, like the first Avengers movie, that little moment where Bruce Banner is convinced that everyone's against him, and he's with Black Widow, and he ends up hulking out and going after her on the helicarrier. That was just a very brief part of the movie, but it was a moment that showed just how terrifying the Hulk could be. Yes, technically the Hulk's a hero, but at the same time, though, he's a monster. And he's a monster that we all love, but he is a monster. And so, in these issues, though, you take the horror that was in that moment, and then you stretch it across a few issues of comic books, and it's a job that's very well done by Roger Stern. And so you have he also does a good job of building on what came before in the first issues of Machine Man that Jack Kirby had done. Like he does a good job of not only carrying on the Hulk story from prior issues in his own series, but also keeping things in line with what went on in the Machine Man series. And so it's not like the Machine Man just wanders in and everyone's confused or anything like that, as far as the readers are concerned. But he was such a good writer that even though I hadn't read any of the issues that had taken place before the ones collected here, he did a good job of setting things up to where I understood what was going on as far as the Hulk's general story is concerned. But yeah, so anyway, though, when it came to, say, the artwork on the story, they had Sal Buscema doing the artwork, and he's someone who is, considered one of the signature Hulk artists in a lot of circles. And I have to concur. He's done, some classic stories, and, when it came to, say, drawing the Hulk, in action, he was kind of like Jack Kirby in the sense that, ordinary people have a certain, almost blocky look to them, but when it came to, say, all-out action, and seeing the Hulk, going from panel to panel, it was just a work of art. Anytime you saw him draw the Hulk. And so, how does he do on Machine Man? He does pretty good, and you can tell he takes some cues from Jack Kirby as far as the action goes, as well as the detail of Machine Man's technology. But basically there was a cinematic grace that while maybe not quite in the same realm as Jack Kirby, Sal Buscema manages to make things his own. He manages to bring his own unique flair to things. And so, the excitement and the momentum that Jack Kirby had set up is continued in these issues of The Incredible Hulk. And so you have, a good segue into another series in which, you're given a rather unsettling, reminder of just how, brutal of a being the Hulk can be, but also continuing Machine Man's own story as well. And so the second portion of the book was really well done. And so now we get to the third portion of the book. And this is where things unfortunately go downhill for me. So at this point, rather than the Machine Man series being restarted, say, from a new issue 1 or something like that, they went ahead and came back and started things off with issue 10, and so the series went on from issues 10 through 19, and that was the remainder of the series. But in that time, the series was picked up by a guy named Tom DeFalco, who I think is probably better known as an editor, than as opposed to a writer. But I mean, he did do some writing back in the day, and as far as the artwork goes, that's where Steve Ditko came into play. And the first issue, is actually pretty good as far as both writing and illustrating, and I was really looking forward to that because I mean, Steve Ditko and Jack Kirby are two very different artists, but you put either one of those guys in realms that they're comfortable with, and look out, you're going to get some works of art. And so I mean, Steve Ditko, I mean, he always excelled at drawing more abstract and surreal stuff, like alien environments, bizarre creatures, things like that. Or when he was working on Spider-Man, I mean, even though, I mean, the people kind of look cheesy, when it came to the villains, like, say, Mysterio or Dr. Octopus, Sandman, I mean, anytime, he was drawing those guys, I mean, there was a lot of creativity put into depicting, like, how, their powers, worked, or, these were very memorable villains in terms of, visuals alone. And or even in the issues they worked on that had Doctor Strange. I mean, he was fantastic at drawing parallel dimensions and things like that. And so it was always a treat to see his work on when it came to, I guess you could say, the more paranormal stuff. But unfortunately, I guess when it came to his work on Machine Man, I'm not sure what was going on with him at the time, and I hate to say this because I mean, I really like the guy's work for the most part, but Machine Man, I think he was having a series of off days, because once you get past, say, like the 10th issue, which was when Tom DeFalco and Steve Ditko first worked on the series, both the writing and the artwork just just really goes downhill. And so I mean, Steve Ditko, was probably at his best in terms of, I guess, storytelling, say, in the 60s and early 70s, but this was like in like 78, 79, maybe 1980, but it was somewhere around there. But I guess he kind of made me think of, say, an artist who was struggling to adapt with the times, because like some of the characters that he creates specifically for Machine Man to fight, they have this very, I guess you could say, Silver Age look to them. And I mean, they have this sort of cartoonish look, to where, you look at them and you're thinking, there's no way you can really take them seriously. And even though they're supposed to be a threat, it's just, they're laughable in design. And that might have worked with, say, a story from the 60s, which, I mean, Steve Ditko, I mean, he was really, groundbreaking when it came to doing stuff like that. But, when you've had, issues, that have set up so much potential, and maintained that potential, and then you come in and basically throw it back, maybe a decade or two behind, that's not a good thing. And not only just from a visual standpoint, but also the writing. And I don't know for sure. I'm thinking this might have been one of Tom DeFalco's, first writing gigs. I don't know if it was his actual first, but it had to have been one of his earlier gigs. But his writing skills in this volume, unfortunately, leave a lot to be desired. And how sometimes, a good writer, when it comes to comic book characters, they'll have, they're clearly wanting to show the character's thought process. And like, say, for instance, you get someone like Chris Claremont, who, is arguably, the best writer on the X-Men series back in the day. He was really good at conveying a character's, train of thought, through, their thoughts, they're like thought bubbles and things like that. And there's nothing wrong with that. But when you have that exact same, amount of, thought being switched from, say, thought bubbles to, speech bubbles, what you basically have happening is Tom DeFalco, has either Machine Man or other characters, doing a soliloquy, because they'll literally be by themselves, but they'll be ranting and raging, or they'll just be, moaning and groaning about something, for, several panels. And, you're like, okay, I get that Machine Man has a lot on his plate as far as, his psychological, stuff, the stuff that's going on in his head. He's got a lot of unresolved issues with humanity. But see, we already know that, though, okay? We've had several issues that have established that, and they've done a much better job of establishing that than what Tom DeFalco is doing. And basically, whenever he's writing Machine Man, going through, like, I guess you could say, the exact same thought processes that had been established beforehand, there's a lot of been there, done that, but also it starts to read like a really bad soap opera. So, I guess there's some moments that are supposed to be profound, but unfortunately, they just come across as like something out of a bad soap opera in terms of, writing quality. And, and at that point, it kind of made me think of a saying. I heard it from I think it was a Burt Reynolds movie, and I'm sure the saying's been said before that, but this is the first time I've heard it. But the saying goes something along the lines of, an audience will forgive a lousy second act if you can wow them with a third act. Well, unfortunately, this book, what ends up happening instead is you have a good first and second act, but a really lousy third act. And so, even like the villains in this last third of the book are really lame. And there's like a kingpin wannabe by the name of Kublai Khan, who looks just like Wilson Fisk almost, except Oriental, and he's so morbidly obese that he can hardly move, but somehow he's got a criminal empire. And so it's like, Kingpin had a lot of weight on him, but it was established that a lot of that weight was muscle. But Kublai Khan, no, the guy's literally morbidly obese, but somehow he has his own empire. And so as opposed to anyone trying to say, hey, let's bump this unhealthy guy off, well, they all follow his instructions, regardless of how ridiculous they are. And they're like, yeah, let's just, pitch, so-and-so, off a cliff, and, instead of just rebelling against this guy who can't defend himself, just little stupid stuff like that. But I guess you could say the most noteworthy menace from this part of the book is a woman named Sunset Bane, aka Madame Menace. Now, I'm not going to say she was particularly a good villain or villainess, but she was probably the most consistent in this part of the book. Now, they did also have a congressman, a guy named Congressman Brickman, who eventually became Senator Brickman, who was a carryover from the Jack Kirby issues. And I will admit that there was some consistency with his character in terms of how antagonistic he was and trying to turn the public against Machine Man through political machinations, and so yeah. So I appreciated the consistency in terms of that, but even then though, while the character was consistent under Tom DeFalco's pen, he came across like if someone like J. Jonah Jameson had scored a seat in politics. And considering that Steve Ditko had worked with Stan Lee to create characters like J. Jonah Jameson, I'm wondering if that was intentional. But anyway, though, it felt like someone who, okay, a familiar face, but okay, you're taking a bear. Let's just move on already. That kind of thing. But as far as Madam Menace goes, she was probably the character that, in terms of the rogues gallery that Tom DeFalco and Steve Ditko came up with, she I'm not going to say I liked her, but she's the one that I found myself actually believing her to be a threat against Machine Man. At one point she actually manages to take one of his arms and basically manipulate him from afar, and so and she kind of has him under her thumb for a bit, and there's other stuff too, but she has like her own criminal empire, and as opposed to say a character like Kublai Khan, who who somehow has his own criminal empire, but you're looking at him and physically speaking, he's incapable of defending himself. Then you look at a character like Madam Menace, and even though she's not the most original character, you can at least believe that she has a criminal empire. Like her having a criminal empire makes sense within the story, and because she's capable of defending herself and going to war if she has to, but she's also capable of seducing in her socialite alter ego of Sunset Bane, she seduces political opponents into doing exactly what she wants. And so at the very least, even though she wasn't the most original foe, she was probably the most believable foe, and as far as the Steve Ditko and Tom DeFalco issues go. But other than her, though, the stories left a lot to be desired, at least in this segment of the book, and it was really a chore to get through. You had a few monsters, or I guess you could say mutate people who have been turned into monsters that were sort of like monsters of the week that Machine Man ended up going against, but they ended up being like, okay, this might have worked in the 1950s, but come on, this is like 1979, 1980. Come on, you can do better. And also, another thing I didn't like was the fact that for some reason they decided to have him. Tom DeFalco decided to have Machine Man take a job at a newspaper company or new and kind of like Clark Kent. And at that point, you're like, okay, now you really are just ripping off another book here, and it's like you got a lot of forced humor from his coworkers, and you have a love story that kind of goes nowhere. And there might have been say a moment here and there where it sort of manages to recapture the quality of Machine Man's wanting to fit in with humanity, but also being distrustful of them. But those moments are few and far between, because you had to contend with a lot of, lousy dialogue that sounded like something off of either a bad sitcom or a bad soap opera. And it was like a poor man's version of Superman, as far as, the secret identity stuff goes. So that was another thing I didn't like. Now, the very last story that's collected in here, it was a standalone story from an issue of Marvel Comics Presents, number 10. And Marvel Comics Presents was kind of like an anthology series. Each issue would have 4 8-page stories, And so issue 10 had an 8-page standalone Machine Man story that took place, I guess, long after the original series ended, because it was like I think it was like 89 or 90. But it's, short, simple. Machine Man goes up against several rogue robots that, are basically, trying to create, one all powerful robot. But the problem is, it's like, they're so inept though, like that, their moments of power are, very limited. So this one robot might be fighting Machine Man and giving him a good rumble, but then suddenly his power will cut out and he'll have to run away. And so so for whatever reason they're trying to capture Machine Man and use his body and for, I guess, their ultimate device or whatever and what have you. I mean, it's an okay story, and I guess it's an improvement over the prior issues by Tom DeFalco and Steve Ditko, and even actually has some halfway decent artwork by Steve Ditko. And part of that could have been you had Dave Cockrum inking over Steve Ditko's pencils, and so things looked a lot more polished, and there was a more vital quality to them that was missing from the Steve Ditko issues that he did on the actual Machine Man series. And you also saw a couple of familiar faces, pop up in the story as just a little cameo, But yeah, it wasn't that good of a story. It wasn't really anything special. And so, I see why they included it, because it was a story that was illustrated by Steve Ditko, and this collection, it's called the Complete Collection, and it has all the work by Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko, but at the same time, though, it just, as far as it being kind of a coda to the book or the Machine Man story in general, it's, like I said, it's an improvement over the other Steve Ditko and Tom DeFalco stories, just, I guess, partially because it's written by someone else and it's such a short story that it's inconsequential, but at least it looks good. But they could have ended it better, I guess. But and now that I'm thinking of it, though, there was one character I kind of liked that was introduced during the Tom DeFalco and Steve Ditko phase. It was a mechanic by the name of Gears Gavin, who, it's kind of a cheesy name, but he ended up being like one of the few other people next to Dr. Spaulding, who in Machine Man could actually call friend. And so, whereas Dr. Spaulding, actually was a professional psychologist, you had someone like Gears Gavin, who was just a blue-collar mechanic, but, he had his own unique take on, humanity and, how Machine Man could try and integrate with it even more. And, he tried to, help Machine Man, with his technology and things like that. And so, but, I kind of liked his character, but I was like, okay, I liked him, but, I wish he were in a better book, so, anyway, though, so, yeah, overall, I enjoyed reading this collection, but I guess, unfortunately, though, while the first two sections of this book are really good, very well done, it's the final section of this book that it's a major letdown. And another thing is, while it's called the Complete Collection, there are a couple of issues that are missing, and in particular, there's a series that Jack Kirby worked on before Machine Man. It was called 2001: A Space Odyssey, which was initially a straight-up adaptation of the classic science fiction film by Stanley Kubrick, but Jack Kirby also continued it and made his own, mythology off of it. And it only lasted 10 issues, but in the final 3 issues, that's where the character of X-51, aka Machine Man, made his first appearance. And that's where you saw that epic battle between the military and his robot brethren. That it's brought up a lot in here, but you never actually see it, because I guess because not only do those events take place outside of Machine Man, but I guess because 2001: A Space Odyssey is tied to, a classic movie. I mean, I'm sure maybe there's like legal red tape, legal issues that prevented, the people who put this collection together from including those issues in here. And so, I mean, it would have been nice, to have those 3 issues in here, because then you really would have had the complete collection. But as it is, I mean, you just hear all sorts of, repeated references to this great battle that went on, and Colonel Cragg brings it up a lot, as do several other people, but you never actually see it because it's not collected in here. But to be fair, though, while there is kind of a feeling initially of you're being dropped into the middle of things, I mean, Jack Kirby, did a good job of catching the reader up, and you eventually got what was going on. I mean, within a few pages. And so, I mean, that was my other nitpick. I mean, for something that's called the complete collection, it sure is missing, those 3 vital, chapters that had Machine Man's first appearance before his actual series. But I mean, overall, though, while I was harping on it, I know, overall, though, I did enjoy reading the book. And, I would say that while, yes, the final third of the book is a slogfest, the first 2/3 of the book were very fun. They're very exciting, and at times I would say even thought-provoking, both from a science fiction perspective as well as, just, a philosophical perspective as well. And so I would say that, if you're a fan of thought-provoking science fiction, albeit, from, like, say, the 70s or 80s, Machine Man's worth taking a look. Or especially if you're a fan of Jack Kirby, I would definitely say pick this collection up, because, I mean, even though Jack Kirby only, worked on Machine Man for the first 9 issues, there's a lot of amazing work in there, both, to look at as well as, to read. And also, you have a really good Incredible Hulk story by, Roger Stern and Sal Buscema. And, those segments alone, like, I guess you could say those segments, they really stand out as far as, exciting stories to read. And I could say that even you might even just want to kind of skip the Tom DeFalco and Steve Ditko portion of the book. And I hate to say that, because I mean, Tom DeFalco, I mean, he's done some decent stuff since then, but this was not his best work at all. And unfortunately, Steve Ditko, I mean, he's done some groundbreaking stuff, but this was not his best work. Obviously, you get this book, you check it out, it's up to you. I would say it's worth checking out, and depending on, say, your fondness of Jack Kirby or science fiction and comic books, I would say that it's worth a look, but I'm not sure if it's going to be everyone's cup of tea, though, just simply because of the lousy third act in the book. And I enjoyed reading it, but I was let down in the end. But taking everything into account, I'll give it 3 stars out of 5. It was decent. And so I would say that as far as work by Jack Kirby and Steve Ditko goes, definitely take a look at their stuff if you can, because both artists have done some phenomenal things. And, if this serves, say, as an introduction to, either one of those artists for you, I mean, all the better. Just especially with Steve Ditko, though, there's been some better work, outside of Machine Man. But as far as Jack Kirby goes, the guy had the touch. But thank you very much for taking the time to check out this review. Got any questions, comments, let me know. Bye.